Hello and welcome to Access. My guest today is Tom Curcio. He's a psychotherapist practicing in East Hampton. And we're particularly interested in what notice has been given. The New York Times had an article on it, on the feminization of psychotherapy. Tom, what is the feminization of psychotherapy?
Well, maybe we should leave that definition to the Times, but I think when you had alerted me to the Times article, I think my first response was, this is news. I mean, it's been trending this way for a long time. So I think they were really just talking about the fact that the vast majority of psychotherapists these days are women, and the trend seems to be continuing to the point where it may become almost an entirely female field. So I think that's what the Times was getting at.
And does this change anything? I mean, after all, they take the same courses, have the same certification, presumably the same scientific objectivity. What does it matter?
Well, it might not matter. We'll see, but it could change some things. And I think what we just want to be aware of is whether or not things get out of balance. I think it might be better for the field to have things be a bit more proportional.
Well, how would it get out of balance? If more women are interested and they see psychotherapy as a mission, what effect could it have, positive or negative?
Well, there are fundamental differences in the ways that men and women see the world, and without colleagues for a new generation of therapists, without male colleagues, some things might get missed.
Well, be specific here. What might
you be specific.
No, you're the therapist. What effect will it have on men? For example, do you believe that a man visiting a woman psychotherapist might find himself receiving less objectivity, less knowledge of what a man is?
I would say, generally speaking, no. But there are some areas where that actually could happen. The first thing, just in general, by the way, is that if men perceive this as a female activity, they're not going to do it. If men think that psychotherapy is something, by women for women, they're going to be more reluctant to come in and see a therapist in the first place. And it doesn't necessarily mean, by the way, that men should have to see female therapists or only male therapists. Sometimes it's better for a man to see a female therapist. So I want to make that clear. And always better to see a good female therapist than a mediocre male therapist. We have to make that clear.
Yeah, sure. We'll take that for granted. Mm-hmm. But you said in a recent broadcast that women place more value on relationships than men. Mm-hmm. Now, what did you mean by that? And how might that skew therapy for a man?
Well, if we assume that that's true, then there could be a tendency on the part of women therapists to see that as a pathological response or a problematic response rather than as normal and natural. Men don't place as much. Men place value on other things other than relationship. Relationships are not necessarily primary or the ultimate goal for men.
Well, I feel one unspoken word here is sex. I mean, men and women have different attitudes to sex. Now, might that be a problem in psychotherapy?
Yes, sex, jobs, there are a number of things. But yeah, I think that, for example, male sexuality is often mocked, poked fun at, and pathologized. For example, if a male comes into therapy and wants to talk about his love life, he may feel a bit uncomfortable if he feels he's being judged because, for example, for a man to say, oh yeah, I've had a string of one-night stands, is perfectly normal. And I don't think another male would look at that and say, ooh, there's something wrong with this guy necessarily. A female might, a woman might. I'm not saying she would, but she might see that as, well, something must be missing. He must have intimacy problems, that kind of thing.
Do you know of any situations where this has happened in psychotherapy, where men have been pathologized because they have a different attitude to sex, or might have a
Okay.
different attitude.
Well, I
to
can think
sex.
of a great example, but it's not about sex. I had an incident a number of years ago with a therapist who was working for me, and a very good one, and I'm friendly with her to this day, a lovely woman. But this was a divorce case, and she was reporting to me, the situation. And at one point, she said to me, I asked her, well, well, what about the dad? What about the father? And her response was, well, the father's a scumbucket. And I said, well, how do you know that? And she said, well, the mother told me. Uh,
He said, who told?
the mother told me. She was seeing the child of divorce, and had totally taken this mother's point of view as the valid point of view. Um, and that could happen in many scenarios, but including around sexuality, that men don't need to be emotionally close to have sex. They don't necessarily feel that they have to be in a relationship. There's not an urgency about being in a relationship the way it might be for some women. So that could be judged and pathologized.
Are there any other areas where it comes in? You do family therapy,
Mm-hmm.
right? What kind of thing might come up in family therapy, where a man or woman therapist, where men might feel that they're not being understood properly?
Well, a couple of ways. First of all, men are never as good at verbalizing as women are. And so talk therapy in itself is a little alien for men. And so we have to watch that. If a man isn't as articulate, it doesn't mean that he's not on top of things, or doesn't, know what he's talking about. Often I also see what I call fix the broken man syndrome, where
What's that?
fix the broken man syndrome, where a wife may come in or call up and say, we're having some marital problems. This is what's wrong with my husband. Could you help him? Or even in this, he must need medication, or he must need this, rather than see it as a dynamic between the two. And I've seen therapists sometimes fall prey to that,
Yeah, and male therapists, you feel, are less likely to fall prey to that.
Well, I'm not so sure. I hope so, but I think if
Right.
there were more men in the field, at least that kind of thing might be raised. If you've got a small number of men in the field, they're going to be afraid to speak out, and they're going to start to adapt to the dominant culture.
Well, why are there fewer men in the field? This started out as an overwhelming male field and seemed to be skewed toward the view of men.
Yes and no. It certainly did all the because of the culture and the times, women weren't able to rise to positions of prominence, and so yes, all the theoreticians, all the kind of big names were male names. Although, let's remember that Freud's daughter, after Freud's daughter was the biggest name in the field for a while.
But now they're saying 90% of the graduates are women.
Yeah, I think what's happened is that a couple of things. You have to that around the 1980s, social workers were being much more recognized in terms of psychotherapy, and were eligible for insurance reimbursement and that kind of thing. And social work has always been a predominantly female field. So a lot of that has to do with social work. But I think the big issue is that not that women entered the field, but that men left the field, and they left the field in droves. And they don't enter it now. And the reason they don't is that it's been decimated by managed care and low pay, and men generally will stay away from fields where the pay is low. So the ability to earn a living has gone down in psychotherapy, and I think that may be a factor. And plus, it may be attractive to women in other ways as well, and we'd have to really ask women why they would find it more attractive than other work.
Why do you think they do?
I could venture a guess. I think it'd be better to ask women, but
Well, I'm sure you talk with women about
yeah,
it.
certainly.
Yeah.
It's interesting. It's intellectually stimulating, and it involves a fair amount of nurturing. And I think that many women may see that as attractive, in a career.
Right. Now, we've talked about it before, but elaborate a bit on this decimation matter. Spelling out what has happened. You talk about managed care and
Yeah,
and
in the nonprofit sector, the salaries are just dismally they're just so low, it's horrible, and in the private, private practice sector, managed care has come in and pretty much cut salaries in half. And usually that's about what the reimbursement rate is, about half of what the standard fee would be normally. So that's had an impact, and I think men have stayed away. And then it just becomes a vicious cycle. If more and more women enter and more men think of it as a woman's field, I think men stay away from it. And it's a shame because we need what we need is a balanced field. We need men and women in there together.
Well, do you have more men? And I hear of these male therapists getting $600 a visit and more, and that it's no longer a full hour. You can get $600 for 20 minutes, and so that kind of thing. Now, prescribing medication.
Okay, that's a whole different thing, though. That's not psychotherapy. That's psychiatry. And I don't know anybody who actually $600 an hour. If you know who's doing that, could you find the secret and let me know what it is? Because male or female, I really don't know too many people getting. Yeah.
You say it's a completely different field, but I as a layman don't understand what the big difference is, except one has a medical degree and one doesn't. But what else is the difference?
Well, the difference is that in psychiatry, the problem is being looked at medically, and usually it means a question of whether or not to prescribe medication. So that's really much more like a visit to any doctor's office. It's a different kind of visit. Talk therapy is, supposedly 45 to 50 minutes, although usually at least many therapists will run a little bit longer than that, closer to a full hour. And the fee for that is certainly it's certainly not $600 an hour, probably averages more about 120 or 125, depending on the degree. But the insurance companies will pay at most half of that, less a deductible, of course, and less a copay. So they may pay 40, for example, and expect a patient to pay the other 20.
So if the fee's $125 an hour, it goes down to $65 an hour, and the insurance company is paying $45.
Yeah, actually more like 40, but yeah.
More
yeah.
like 40.
Yeah.
And then the patient is paying a share of that too.
That's right.
Yeah.
That's right.
Yeah. Last time you were here a couple of months ago, I think it was even longer than that, we were talking about the effect that the economy and the current political situation is having on men.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, would you just sum that up again briefly for people that didn't see that broadcast?
Well, I don't know if I could sum that up, but I could get to the essence of it, which is about male shame. And I'm actually glad you brought that up, because that's one of the things that I think without male colleagues, female therapists could miss sometimes, the degree of shame a man feels at the loss of a job, at not getting a promotion, at a stalled career. And female responses to that, like, maybe you should get some support, why don't you talk to people, only serve to increase a man's shame. And so the last thing a man would do in general would be to let me go talk to people about the fact that my career is stalled or I've lost my job. And I think that women may not be aware of the degree of male shame. And the reason for that is that men, I think, in relationships as husbands and fathers, basically see their function as protector providers,
Right.
And that's a big deal, that. So if a man isn't fulfilling that, he feels, shame right down to his DNA, On the other hand, if he is fulfilling that, he doesn't really understand why a woman would want more of him. And it takes some coaching and some psychoeducative work to help men understand why their girlfriends and wives might want something more for them. It's not natural for a man to do that. Doesn't mean a man can't do it, and doesn't mean the culture can't support it, and it doesn't mean we don't have choices. It just means it's not natural. Men have to learn that. It's learned behavior.
More of him in what sense? More of a man how?
Wait,
well, if a man, you say if a man's supporting a woman well,
mm-hmm.
And providing for his family,
Mm-hmm.
and women still want more of them, and a man can't understand that. What is it you find that women want that men have trouble giving?
Well, it could be a lot of things. It could be just more talk. It could be, more interaction, more sensitivity. Discussing certain, watching a certain type of television program. I mean, there could be all sorts of things. But the man doesn't really get it. He's like, kind of like, but I've done my job. If I've kept my family protected and safe, all the rest seems somewhat irrelevant to men. Again, they can learn that it's not irrelevant, and they can learn how to be more responsive to the women in their lives, but what we don't want to do is put them down for that and pathologize them for it. And that's the thing that's worrisome, is that if we're going to pathologize men for being, a little schizoid or cold or sometimes controlling, or having intimacy problems, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Men don't know how to maybe verbalize, hey, this is wrong. Why am I being responded to like this? But they just know that they feel bad.
What does being a little schizoid mean?
Cut off from emotion, all intellect, very little feeling, that kind of thing,
Yeah. Is there such a thing as sex addiction?
Well, there is such a thing.
One hears this term all the
Yeah,
time.
I mean, I personally prefer. I don't like to use the addiction word for that, and I prefer the word compulsion. And some men and women both can find themselves having any variety of compulsive behaviors, and sex can be one of the behaviors that can be compulsive. But it's almost as if sometimes we categorize kind of all male sexuality as either compulsive or somehow problematic, And,
Well, it's no secret that men think about sex a great deal.
yeah, what was that old? I don't even know
Is
if it
that-
was a real study, but remember, people would say, men think about sex once every 7 seconds or something like that. And of course, the joke the tagline to that is that and each thought lasts for 6.5 seconds. But but the fact is, that's how we're wired. We're made to do that. That's our DNA. And to
I think that's very important. Yeah, would you say that again? We're wired.
Yeah, we're designed to do that. We're designed to be procreators. We don't need a whole lot of emotional connection. Not that we don't like it, not that it's not wonderful when it happens. But and certainly it's inappropriate if a man is with a woman and he sees another attractive woman to turn his head and gawk. Men should learn not to do such things. But to say, if he even thought it, there's something wrong with him, is worrisome to me. And often we also hear, sometimes said jokingly, sometimes not so jokingly, but there are two words that we often use to describe men, or we don't, but women do, which is, pigs and dogs. Dog is the affectionate one, and pig is a little bit less affectionate. But a little bit, but all of us, I think, found it horrible when that trend started of calling women bitches. I mean, it was a terrible thing, but it should also be horrible to call men dogs. Why is that okay? Men aren't dogs, men are men. And that's the way we're designed.
Well, what about do you think the whole word addiction is overused? Or over-applied? You think heroin addiction, tobacco addiction, coffee, all of that. You think it's...
I think it can at times be used to control people, and often to control men, and it's also a way for men to get a clean start. If they've had a lot of behavior that's considered bad, they can just say, well, I was a sex addict, but I went to a program and now I'm better. Or we had a president who did that with drugs.
a president?
A president who used alcohol and cocaine, but then he was saved, and it was if you get to wipe the slate clean. So. People use that in some very incorrect ways. There are people who are truly compulsive. And
Which president was that?
President Bush, of course.
Who?
Bush.
Oh, right. Oh, okay.
You forgot about all that, huh?
Yeah, I have, thankfully.
And certainly, I think half the country called President Clinton the sex addict, which really an addict, I don't know. He was being a man, and I'm saying his behavior was the kind of behavior we want in a leader, and we certainly don't want it, certainly shouldn't be publicized, but we don't know if he's an addict of any kind, but we're very prone to doing that, We've got the TV, guys like me who come on TV and want to tell people what to think.
When last we talked, we were talking about, you said that your clients really resented the inequalities in the country. They're being out of work and seeing so much money going to so few people in a profession, occupation, that, investment in banking that nearly destroyed the country, but that they felt lethargic and little was happening. Now we have Occupy Wall Street, and we see the beginning of it. Have you noticed any change of attitude in your clients?
I've noticed people cheering for it and feeling good about it.
People you would expect to cheer, or people who might have been more conservative in their views?
Quite a mixture, really. What I'm thrilled about, though, is I see men perking up when this happens, because this is a little bit closer to a male response, take action, do something. It's very hard, people don't know what to do in a scenario like this, and men are very goal-directed, and the idea of taking some kind of action, I think, really appeals to them. And when you talk to men, they'll tell you secretly, I'm probably among them, that if I weren't afraid to go to jail, maybe I'd be down there and maybe I'd be lobbing Molotov cocktails, which is probably a more...
So there is real anger. Yeah.
Oh, there's real anger. But to say that, again, people will look at you like there's something a little off about you, this kind of brings us back to our topic too, that the... often in therapy, if you want to parody a therapist, what do you say? How do you feel about it? Everybody knows you're parodying a therapist. And we often ask men for their feelings, and I've seen this happen many times, express your anger kind of a thing. And when people do express their anger, there's a lot of fear. And really, it's not that wise to promote male anger. Male anger is frightening, and it is dangerous, and I think therapists make a mistake. It's one thing if you're patient can say, "Oh, I'm really angry about something," but if they're really angry about something, it's not going to come out like that. And so often we see this encouragement to express feelings, and then whoops, I don't want to treat you. I'm going to refer you to somebody else, or you must need medication, or whatever. Men feel angry and they want to act. Processing things, just talking things over, it's just not a natural medium for men. Men can learn how to do it, and it can be helpul to them, but it's not that easy. That's not typically male. If a man gets angry, he wants to take action.
So a man gets angry, wants to take action. He goes to a therapist for whatever reason and starts expressing his feelings, and then finds out that's not appropriate. It could be very, it's certainly an indication of why they might want to see someone who understands the expression of anger,
That's
real
right,
anger,
yeah.
whether it's a man or a woman.
And also
I'm sure
knows
you get women expressing anger a lot. Too.
Absolutely. But in general, female anger, until it hits a certain point, it's not quite as dangerous. I think men can do harm more quickly than women can, and it only makes sense to be aware of that and to not, push buttons before a person is ready. But yeah, certainly, look, we all know women get angry too, and I've had staff of mine being, kind of knock on my door, I need some help. This was many years ago, and what happened? Well, I was doing a couples session, and she got really mad at him, stood up and kicked him and knocked him on the ground and kept kicking him.
In your office?
Not in my office, but in the therapist's office. Yeah. So yeah, women get angry. We all know though that men are much more assaultive than women. The piece people don't know is that when women do become violent, they're much more deadly. They're more likely to kill or create serious injury, a stabbing, a shooting, bludgeoning, that kind of thing. So the vast number of that kind of violence is probably the first action is usually done by a man, but when women do it, they do it with much more serious consequences. You know.
How did you get into this field?
Boy, Richard, yeah, that's ancient history.
Well,
You're going.
you
you're
got
going-
almost 2 minutes to tell me.
Almost 2 minutes. Well, I will tell you one thing. One element of it was that I was actually, because I kind of came of age along with the feminist movement, back in the very early 70s, back in the days where, women really did earn less than men, and people would actually seriously have discussions like, well, if a man and a woman do the same job, is it really right to pay the woman as much? I mean, it really was like that, and people forget how much has changed. And I was pretty impressed with the idea that, hey, we didn't all have to be macho all the time, and it turned out to be very disappointing. But this idea of men maybe being allowed to have their quote unquote feminine side, which never really went too far. It didn't do a lot for men, but at the time seemed very exciting. And this seemed, along with a whole variety of other reasons, this seemed to be a good way to go. But I was influenced by early feminism, and thought it was
Influenced by?
what I'll call early feminism. Feminism
Right,
back
right.
in that era.
Right, yeah.
And I
Yeah.
really thought we were gonna, promote a better world by helping people get in touch with who they are and being able to live authentic lives. But we learn as we go. And one of the things we learn is that men and women are really, truly different. And if we're going to treat them, we really need to know about both men's issues and women's issues.
Right. All right, Tom, thank you very much. All right, Thomas Curcio, psychotherapist with office on North Main Street in East Hampton, discussing addiction and the feminization of psychotherapy. And very interesting it is. Thank you, Tom.
Thank you, Richard.
Yeah.